So here we are in part 2 of the history and her story of photography, and we've stopped with Nadar, who was the first celebrity photographer. And let's move on because there's a lot to cover in the history of photography. And so Nadar was very visionary, and he really was the first person to think of this. So it was pretty amazing stuff. So the next person who was very important in the history of photography is a woman. And she is the first genius of photography, right? So her name is Julia Margaret Cameron. And this woman was pretty darn amazing, okay? She's the very first, and let me just write this down because I think we need to remember this. We'll put it down here. She's the very first genius of photography. And let me tell you why. Okay, so she came up with methods that kind of combined the best of the daguerreotype with the best of the calotype. And the daguerreotype had an issue, and that was and the reason this is so important is because the daguerreotype was not able to be reproduced. So you could only do a one-off. So if you wanted a whole bunch of little photographs, right, little daguerreotypes, you had to take a bunch of little separate ones, right? You couldn't take one and have it reproduced. Now the calotype that was invented by William Henry Fox Talbot, okay, that one was a negative-positive process, just like we have today, except the negative was paper. And it could be reproduced, which is why Fox Talbot was able to publish the very first book illustrated with photographs, The Pencil of Nature. Isn't that exciting? Like, wow, right? So, the calotype had its pros, it had its cons because the paper negatives were a little fuzzy, so they weren't really sharp. The daguerreotypes, however, were incredibly sharp. Even though they were small, you could actually see the pores on people's skin. It was that detailed. They were incredibly detailed. And they were just little miniature, images. But you couldn't reproduce them, which was a big con. In other words, it was not a good thing for the photograph. And obviously, the daguerreotype didn't stick with us today, right? We're not using that process. So Julia Margaret Cameron, she found a way or methods where she combined the best of the daguerreotype with the best of the calotype, right? And that was a process called the Collodium Wet Plate. Right. This made photography portable. Okay, this is a very important thing. So this made it portable. Before, with the daguerreotype, you had to be in a studio. It had a lot of equipment and chemicals that couldn't be transported. So they had to be done all right in one place. So people had to come to a studio to get their portrait taken, right? It wasn't something they could do anywhere else. So, so she invented this process, which is pretty amazing, right? And this is a woman. Now, she had this thought that she really wanted to show the inside as well as the outside of the subject. In other words, she wanted to reveal the personality, the soul of the sitter through her photographs. And she came up with some things that completely changed photography. Besides this technical process, she not only invented a technical process. She invented artistic processes and techniques. So she invented lighting, right? Lighting, camera angles, right? That's angles, not angels. Posing, and even the use of props, right? So lighting, all the lighting that we studied in the beginning of class, direct and fill, and diffused. She experimented and used those and found out how they worked and how they worked better for each photograph, or for each subject, like which one would you use for what, right? She invented camera angles, using different camera angles instead of just being straight on with the camera. She experimented with doing, looking up at subjects, looking down on subjects from the side. She experimented with all this stuff that we still use today. Posing her subjects in ways that helped reveal their personality, and the use of props, right? Telling something about the person by them holding an object of some sort, right? Like a golfer might hold a golf club, or someone who likes gardening might be holding a shovel or a plant or something, right? So there's some way to tell what that person is interested in and what inspires them in their lives, right? So she invented all these things. These are all things that we use today. This is all stuff we learned in class, you guys, and she invented it. She invented a process that was portable and was easier to use with shorter times of exposure and development. And she invented the artistic side of photography as well. Like, really an amazing woman. And her story is pretty cool too. So these are all, like I said, these are all standard practices that we use today, all standard photography practices. So she was a woman who was very rich. She was born into money. She married a very wealthy man, and she traveled all around the world. And when she was in her 40s, she had raised her kids. Her kids had all moved off, and she decided to take up photography as a hobby, basically. And she became one of the most amazing photographers of her time. And it kind of interestingly, though, I saw something on the History Channel of some time back where they were talking about the history of photography, and the narrator said, "Oh, isn't it a shame? She never had a show of her work, and she never sold any photographs." Well, realistically, she was really rich. Like, she traveled around like with the highest or most the 1%ers. She was with the 1%ers. How's that? She had a lot of money. She didn't need to charge for her photographs. In fact, it would have been in poor taste. It would have been rude to ask for money. She didn't need money. I mean, why would she do that, right? And at the time, remember, you had to be very educated to be a photographer. That's why Hill, teamed up with Adamson, a chemist, because they needed that education. So she was well-educated. She was literate, very rich, and she traveled, in circles of kings and queens and princes and the highest up in society around the world. So it would have been rude for her to ask for money. Now, the other side of that coin is, of course, she never had an exhibition of her work, because at that time, photography was not considered an art form. Nobody was exhibiting photographs, right? Nobody. So she was one of the first to think about photography as a potential art form and take photographs that she kind of in an artsy way, which is inventing all these different ways to take these kind of artistic photographs. So really, the narrator was totally off. She was an amazing, amazing woman, Julia Margaret Cameron, and we owe a lot of our photography to her. So she was quite the person. So she invented this Collodium wet plate process that allowed the next important thing in photography, and it had a glass negative, and it was produced when it was still wet. So it was a negative to positive process, and so it still needed some equipment to make it work, but it was more portable, and that allowed for this guy. Matthew Brady. So Matthew Brady was an American living in New England, and he decided he wanted to photograph the Civil War. Because at that time, the Civil War was just going on. And because of Julia Margaret Cameron's invention, he was able to have a portable studio. In other words, he could load his stuff in a wagon, he could set up a tent and take photographs, okay? So he was, the old way to do it would have been too cumbersome, but now this Collodium Wet Plate process allowed him to photograph the war. And during that time, the Civil War, everyone thought when it broke out it was going to be a short war. Battles were no secret. Remember, this was the time when the two armies lined up in lines, and they would march forward and shoot at each other, right? And then the first line of people would fall down dead, and then the second line would come forward. They would shoot at each other, they would fall dead, and then so on and so forth. So that was how they did war, and there were no secrets. Folks would make a picnic and come and watch the battle. I mean, seriously, because everyone knew it was going to happen. Because you have soldiers trampling all around in your neighborhood, basically. So they knew it was going to happen, and folks didn't really know what war was. They kind of thought of it as a game, and farmers would supply both sides with food and sustenance. But because of this particular process that the Collodium Wet Plate that Julia Margaret Cameron invented, it allowed him to bring all his equipment with him, and he was able to set up and photograph battles in the war. Now, this was very shocking to people, because people had never seen this before. They'd never seen all these dead people laying around. They didn't understand the horrors of war, the suffering, people laying in the battlefield injured and suffering, and taking a long time to die, right? They didn't just die outright sometimes. They were laying there suffering for long periods of time. So this was very, very shocking. These photographs were incredibly shocking to people who weren't, people who hadn't witnessed it in person. And this was a problem. So, and at the time, Matthew Brady, he took on an apprentice by the name of Timothy O'Sullivan. Right? No relation to me. So Timothy O'Sullivan, he had a different vision, because Matthew Brady was just trying to basically document the war, right? And like I said, these photographs were incredibly shocking. People were freaked out by them. So Matthew Brady took on this apprentice, Timothy O'Sullivan, and they photographed together for some time. Then Timothy had his own idea, and he went off to do his own thing. And that basically was that he would find a corpse that was very good looking, right? Someone who was very handsome, very attractive, and he would pose it, right? He would make sure they weren't injured on their face or their upper body. And he would pose the corpse in a very romantic way, right? Maybe with a rifle or gun in his hand, and then he would write poetry and to accompany he'd take a photograph and he'd write poetry to accompany that photograph. Something like, "Oh, what visions of his loved ones danced in his head while he, took his last breath defending his country," kind of a thing like that. Right, so he would write these kind of verses to go with it. Well, the public loved it, right? They weren't ready for the horrors of war, right? Because remember, before photography, nobody had taken photographs of war before. If you had a magazine or a newspaper article, you had an artist actually illustrate it. So they never went to the war. They didn't go to the war. They just, imagined what it might look like, and they would know what the uniforms for both sides look like, and they would do like a drawing, an illustration, or a painting about the war. And it was very romanticized, right? Because at that time, if your men went off to war, they either came back, right, or they came back a hero, or they came back dead, right, if they came back at all. So there was people didn't survive these horrible wounds like they do now, where they missing arms or legs or horribly wounded. They usually got infected, right? This is before penicillin. So they'd get infected and they'd die of sepsis, because they would, get gangrene, and they'd have to try to be cutting limbs off and stuff, and their whole body would just be overcome. Organs would shut down and they'd be gone, right? So the people didn't understand how much the suffering went on. So Timothy O'Sullivan really got to the heart of it, right? He really got to a point where people could tolerate the war if they thought it was romantic, right? The war heroes, So, but he was making money off this, right? He was posing corpses on the battlefield and photographing them and writing poetry and selling it to the newspapers, right? And people were eating it up. They loved it. And so if he would find a particularly attractive corpse, he would actually, take the uniform off and switch it for a uniform of the other side, right? He'd maybe have a Union soldier, and then he would take the Union soldier's uniform off and switch it for a Confederate uniform. And then he would take another photograph and with the same poetry, sell it to the newspaper for the Confederate side, right? And the people loved it. They loved that romanticism of war, as opposed to the harsh realities and horrors of war that we know today. And we're a little bit desensitized now because we see violence on television and video games all the time. But at that time, it was very, very shocking. So Timothy O'Sullivan really had, really had something going on there, right? He knew what he was doing. And, you think, oh gosh, how could someone like take a dead person and, put their, change their uniforms or something. And, how they did that was because it was pretty normal for people to have to do that at that time. It was normal for people to handle dead bodies, right? If someone died in your house, you would just basically the family would wash the body, right? Dress the body, lay the body out to have it be on display for mourners to come in and say goodbye, right? This was normal behavior for people. So people weren't freaked out by a dead body, right? Or handling a dead body, because that was what you did. You did it for your family. And, while they did have funeral parlors and funeral homes, like rich people used those, but regular people, right, they would do it all themselves. They would have that in, that's part of their family. They would take care of that, bury the body themselves, right? And if if the body was laid out in state for mourning, it would be fairly quickly, depending on the weather, because, dead bodies kind of tend to stink. So, if it was cold weather, it might be a little bit longer, but warm weather, maybe just a day or, at the most, and then they would bury the body, okay? But the handle of corpses was very different. And, if you see like an old cemetery, if you ever visited a really old cemetery, you'll see that there's a lot of gravestones of children, of babies, because they didn't have vaccines, right? And children died at a huge rate. And a lot of times people would have kids and not 12 kids, and only 2 of them would survive because of childhood disease. And it was very difficult. So, a lot of times photography, you'll see an old photograph of someone looking like they're holding a sleeping baby. Well, the baby's not sleeping. It's a dead baby, right? And because people lost a lot of children, they would take a photograph of their dead baby. That might be the only remembrance they have of their child that they lost. And so photographing dead people wasn't unusual. If grandpa croaked and you didn't have a photo of him, you'd dress him up in his best suit, take him down, you know, in a wagon to the photo studio and have his portrait done after he's dead. Usually the eyes would be closed in those portraits, but sometimes they'd actually paint the eyes in afterwards, which is kind of spooky, and I'll show you some examples of that. But basically, this wasn't as unusual as you might think, right, to have that happen. It was something that happened on a regular basis. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in part 3 of our lecture today. Hi, Sean. Did you just call?
Hi, what's up?
What?
Yeah,
Will you tell me when, and we'll make it our good time. How's that?
okay, well, okay.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. Thanks, Sean.
Okay, I'll see you then.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Please leave your message for
Margaret.
Hi, this is Trish from Downtown Book and Sound. It looks like we missed